So round one, I'm paired against Arne. Arne is on a Grixis Reanimator deck. It is fairly new to the meta, and the goal of their deck is to put a large creature in the graveyard and reanimate it from the graveyard into play. What I mean by reanimate is instead of casting the creature because it costs too much mana, or it's very difficult to cast because there's a bunch of requirements to cast it, they spend a spell that says they can return it from their graveyard play for a very cheap cost. Now, the majority of their deck is made up of removal and reanimation spells and cards to reanimate. So their deck is trying to either reanimate something very fast or make sure that I don't kill them before they reanimate something. My deck is trying to make sure that I have enough pressure in play to kill them before they reanimate something and make sure that I have good removal when they actually go to reanimate something so I can kill the thing that they're reanimating. Because if it sticks around for too long, I will lose the game. Now, of course, these things they're reanimating, Archon and a Boron Oculus, are very hard to not only kill, but also once they are in play, it doesn't really matter if you kill them. There's a little too much value going on for you to really kind of catch up. But, you still have to play from when you're behind a little bit and try to not just fall over and die when your opponent does so. So as we see here on turn one, Arne did cast Faithless Looting and put an Archon of Cruelty in the graveyard. We do have the Static Prison for the Archon, but if the Archon gets put into play and we have a creature, we have to sacrifice the creature. We still discard a card no matter what. We still take 3 damage, and Arne does gain 3 life and draws a card. So it's not really a winning situation for us. So the plays I'm trying to make are trying to not play into him reanimating this Archon. Now, the card that reanimates the Archon is 2 mana. So I assume if he had it, he would have cast it on turn 2 because he had 2 mana. I think it's safe to say that he doesn't have the card that reanimates this Archon on his second turn. He also didn't have Psychic Frog, which is a really important card in his deck and in this matchup. Here we see he drew the Persist to reanimate the Archon, and like I said before, we are now in a really tough spot because we have to deal with this Archon and it's already gained so much value. So with all this in mind, I want to make sure that the plays I make sort of don't play into his plays too much. And if I'm trying to make my plays not play into his plays too much, I don't really want to put too many creatures into play. I could put the Ajani in play and just sacrifice the cat token and flip the Ajani. The issue is they didn't have Persist, so they might not have it the following turn. They could just still have Fatal Push and kill the Ajani and then have the Persist later, and putting the Ajani in play doesn't exactly do a whole lot. So I elected to put the Goblin Bombardment into play because I wanted to make sure that I had the Goblin Bombardment in play on turn 3 no matter what. But I don't want to get caught having my Ajani Fatal Pushed on my turn 2 because it's more mana efficient for him. And if they have Persist on the turn 3, it does the same thing whether the Ajani's in play or not if they also have the Fatal Push. So I just wanted to make sure that I'm losing the least amount of resources in this spot while also making plays that I want to make sure I make by the 3rd or 4th turn. Now, of course, he did put the Archon into play, and we cast Static Prison. And then Ajani, they did have the Fatal Push, which I was sort of trying to play around, but you can't play around it forever. We entered the Archon, and on his turn 4, he follows up and is now casting in a Boron Oculus. This is sort of the issue with the matchup, although I don't necessarily think it's a bad matchup. If both decks play how they want to or according to how their decks are planned to play out without too much interaction. The Grixis deck does have a lot of really big cards that are hard to deal with. We have dealt with the Archon, but it was a 3-for-1 or a 4-for-1 in some ways. And the tempo loss is huge for us because we kind of couldn't commit to the board early. Now, we can beat this Oculus, but if our opponent has any follow-up, whether it be removal, other big creature, we're kind of far behind. So I'm stuck in this position where I have to make plays that sort of advance my game state while trying to play around the 4 cards in my opponent's hand, and it's very difficult to do. Go by, and I've decided that the only way I'm going to win is if I just start attacking into my opponent and hoping that he makes some bad blocks or makes some mistakes and I push through a bunch of damage and kill him somehow. This isn't a good plan, but I think it's the only plan we really have. This Archon underneath this Static Prison is going to come back eventually because we have no ways to gain energy. And him having so many cards in hand, an Oculus in play, and a Frog in play, there's not much in my deck I can draw that will get me out from this position. And even if I do draw those things, I still have to get pretty lucky afterwards. I think the best way for me to win this game is to just rip a Seasoned Pyromancer or a Flage and hope that somehow it gets me to victory. When he plays his Emperor of Bones here, he can just target the Archon of Cruelty in his graveyard, activate the Emperor of Bones, and the game is actually just over. So not much we could have done there. For sideboarding, I don't have a lot of cards except for 2 Ghost Vacuums that are very, very important. I have a few other cards that I like to bring in. Sometimes I like to bring in Showdown because it can turn into a value game. But really, the main game plan is to try to kill my opponent before they do the thing. Or if they do the thing, make sure that we have an answer to it that is efficient and isn't too punishing so that we can continue to play our game. Ghost Vacuum stops their reanimation, so obviously it's the best card in the matchup for us. The issue is that that's all it does. We can get outvalued if we play a Ghost Vacuum and they don't draw the half of their deck that relies on reanimating things. That being said, really their reanimation package is just so strong that you don't really have another choice or another way to sort of sidestep what they're doing. You have to try to stop their reanimation. You have to sort of hope that they don't have an answer to it or that their deck is very reliant on the reanimation package. That being said, I do think the majority of the builds are at this point. So it is rather safe to just have some Ghost Vacuums in this matchup. Here I also elected to bring in 2 Blood Moons and 2 Celestial Purges. I like the Purges because they answer all the cards that, well, not all of them, they don't answer Oculus, but they hit Archon and they hit Emperor of Bones, which are 2 cards that I need to deal with when they hit the board or I'm likely to lose afterwards. As for things I'm cutting, I like cutting Flage here simply because it is 3 mana and it doesn't actually kill anything cleanly in their deck. I'm not trying to grind them out with a Flage because it's very slow and it plays into Emperor of Bones very, very poorly. The other thing was I did have access to Arne's deck list. This was an open deck list event. So I saw that Arne had a few Pyroclasms and Ocelot Pride is the worst card to have against Wrath effects because it A, doesn't have haste like Ragavan, and it B, doesn't make your creatures bigger like Guide of Souls does, and it is pretty bad when it needs to attack. So if you don't have a Guide of Souls or you don't have a Flage, Ocelot Pride does the least amount of work. So I really want to just cut the cards that are bad into the cards that Arne naturally has. Ocelot Pride is bad against Wraths, not great against targeted removal, not great in multiples, bad into his really good creatures. Flage doesn't actually kill that much. I'm not trying to flash it back that often, and they have natural cards like Emperor of Bones in their deck that sort of slow down the Flage flashback anyways. I'd rather have better spot removal in Celestial Purge. I'd rather have a prison lock piece like Blood Moon to sort of prevent them from actually casting their spells or being able to slow down the game so they don't combo me so fast. And then I'd obviously rather have Ghost Vacuum because it interacts with their combo very well. Going into game 2 here, we're on the play, and I think this hand is pretty good even if it is a bit sketchy and there's quite a bit of liability in this hand. We are very weak to a Pyroclasm, and if Arne has it, we're probably going to lose the game. Alternatively, the times where he doesn't have Pyroclasm, we are very far ahead because we have multiple threats that push our advantage, and the times where he has a way to reanimate things, we have a way to follow up and beat them. And the times where he doesn't have Pyro and he doesn't have the turn 2 reanimation, we are probably running away with the game. To follow that up, we have a lot of good draws. Although our second land is an Elegant Parlor, if this first Ocelot Pride hits, we get the second Ocelot Pride to trigger. If we ever see another land in our top 2 cards, we can play the Parlor on turn 2, play the Pride, play a Johnny on 3, and Galvanic Discharge one of the cat tokens to flip the Ajani, sort of giving us a bit of safety from Wrath effects for the board, while also threatening lethal with Ajani's +2. Here, we have a very standard open where we go Ocelot Pride into Ocelot Pride. Arne on his turn 1 goes Steam Vents into Faithless Looting, discard Psychic Frog, discard Troll. This is already very good for us. He didn't discard a big creature to reanimate, and we already have a board built up, so we can sort of start running him over. Now, he has this Frog as a follow-up. It's possible if he had a reanimation spell but didn't have a big creature to reanimate, he can discard those creatures to Psychic Frog and reanimate it after. The difference is, reanimating now isn't as impactful as it is on turn 2. We have a much better board. Follow-up is, we have a lot of breathing room here. We have an answer to the Frog, we have a follow-up if they have a Wrath effect, and we have another removal spell if things get a little weird. So my plan is to sort of keep the pressure up and try to end the game as fast as we can. I think we can safely assume that he didn't have Pyro, because he probably would have played it over playing the Psychic Frog, unless he has exactly a way to discard the creature and reanimate the creature. But like I said before, that's not super impactful, so it's probably just worse than casting Pyroclasm. The only real decision here is if I want to Celestial Purge the Frog now and continue the damage and continue the pressure, or if I want to try to Galvanic the Frog, see what happens, then Celestial Purge it, try to get a few extra cards out of his hand, or if I just want to play the Ajani and attack with everything, see what he blocks, and then flip the Ajani and make a decision there if I want a plus, or if I want a 0. Now, I don't remember exactly the play I ended up making, but I think the safest play is to just purge the Frog and then pass. I get to Surveil with the Marsh Flats if I don't use the mana, and because he didn't discard anything before or reanimate anything before, he does have a Frog and a Troll in his graveyard. I think it's safe to say that he doesn't have the big creature plus reanimate right now. If he draws it, we're still in the fine spot. If somehow we can put it in the graveyard with third land plus Faithless Looting and reanimation spell, we're still pretty good against that. This Frog is very threatening. I want to get it off the board. I'm fine with playing the Ajani and flipping it, but he could also just kill the Ajani if he untaps with the Psychic Frog, right? There is some counter to this where if I play the Ajani like I did in this match and it does flip, I can Galvanic Discharge the Frog afterwards. If he blocks one of the creatures, it'll have a damage on it. So, plus the Galvanic, it needs to be an X5 to survive. That means he has to discard 3 cards. The reason I'm not sure that's great is because he might actually want to discard those cards anyways. I do think that this line is fine. It does keep up the pressure. I'm not worried about Pyroclasm because I think he would have played it. I'm not sure I want to purge this Frog, although it is very strong on this board. It might not be worth the Celestial Purge right now. And I don't want to really waste the Galvanic here because I don't actually think it kills the Frog ever. I don't think he's going to let it die. I think the highest value play I can make is to try and flip this Ajani, force him to attack with the Frog, and continue the board pressure. I do think that there's some argument to say that I could keep up the pressure if I purge the Psychic Frog, but I don't think that I'm going to get a lot of value out of this Ajani otherwise. I want to make sure I get the most amount of value out of it. The other thing is, this keeps up the pressure almost equally as it would if I just purge the Frog and attack, but it also forces Arne to attack the following turn with his Psychic Frog on the Ajani. Now, this entire line does get blown out by a Pyroclasm, so I am really trying to dodge a Pyroclasm, but I think that if he had a Pyroclasm, he would have cast it, and I really don't think I'm beating a Pyroclasm otherwise. If I purge the Frog and he has Pyroclasm, we're pretty far behind. If I don't purge the Pyroclasm, if I don't purge the Frog, and I Galvanic after he Pyros, he can still save it, etc., etc., etc. So I don't really think I can afford to play around a Pyroclasm here. I also think that I need to find a way to beat him when he doesn't have it and not give him enough breathing room to get out the pressure that I'm providing. So here we made the attack play. We flipped the Ajani. I think the correct play is to 0 because it does give us the City's Blessing on the end step, which makes lethal and still forces the attack on the Ajani. There's an argument to plus because it forces him to discard more cards and still threatens a lot of damage the following turn. But I think getting the City's Blessing here is much better against a series of spot removal spells or a series of other blockers or a reanimated Oculus blockers plus potential removal spell. And then I think the rest of this match goes pretty standard. If I remember correctly, Arne untaps, doesn't play a land, gives his Frog flying, discards a few cards, attacks my Ajani, gets the draw card trigger, and then misses on playing Pyroclasm. And I believe he concedes after this, if I remember correctly. Well, he doesn't end up conceding, and he did have the reanimation spell and reanimates the troll. So again, we wanted to make sure we had enough pressure. So if he does reanimate something, we can still untap and kill him. Couldn't really beat a Pyro, not much of a point to play around it. It is nice that it's Troll and not Archon. Archon would be a bit more annoying, but not actually game losing, I don't think. We draw a second discharge here, and this is lethal, I'm fairly certain. 8, 11. I know it's short 1 damage, so he doesn't die unless he fetches. But I do think that, again, we're in such a demanding position that it doesn't exactly matter. I elect to just go to combat. The troll is an X4, so if he blocks the Ocelot Pride, I can discharge it. If he doesn't block the Ocelot Pride, I can also still just discharge it and then purge the frog. And we're in the same spot where you need Pyro or you lose. And if you have a reanimation creature, it doesn't really matter on this board anymore. Ultimately, I elect not to even kill the troll. I don't actually think it matters that much here. It is just a 5/4, and we're at 21. It's not attacking. Blocking doesn't actually change much because now he's at 2, and we're going to kill him if we untap anyways. If he untaps and Pyroclasms, we can still just Galvanic the troll anyways and use the extra energy to also hopefully kill the frog. I don't know if it exactly lines up an energy, but I could just purge it anyways if he does untap and draw Pyro. Again, troll doesn't exactly matter on this board. Don't really need to deal with it right now. Arne untaps, gives the frog flying attacks, draws an extra card off the frog trigger, and then concedes. Going back to sideboarding, I like my configuration. I don't think I'm going to change much. There's argument to bring in the Showdown of the Scalds because I do think the matchup can be kind of grindy, but at the same time, I don't want to have a lot of 4-drops in my openers, and I think that I don't really need to be that grindy to win the game. I think the way we played game 2 on the play was really strong, and we can maybe do that in game 3 on the draw, but also we can just mulligan to removal spell for frog or a ghost vacuum. So we open our hand game 3 here, and it is perfect. Well, almost perfect. Maybe one too many lands, but that's okay. We do have a ghost vacuum, which is obviously very good for us. We get the best card in our sideboard against their deck. Now, there's always the worry that Arne could have Thoughtseize and take the ghost vacuum. We do have a backup plan in Static Prison for that line of play. Now, obviously, like Static Prison isn't as good as an answer as ghost vacuum, and if he has Thoughtseize into reanimation plus reanimate, we are likely going to lose, or at least just very, very, very far behind and need to get lucky to win. That doesn't change keeping the hand, though. Obviously, the hand is very powerful, and if you aren't keeping hands like this, what are we keeping? We just need to dodge a Thoughtseize here. Luckily, Arne did mull the 6, so it's less likely he has everything. If he does have Thoughtseize, he might not have the reanimation spell. If he doesn't have Thoughtseize and he has the reanimation spells, we have the answer. So we're in a pretty good position. He leads his turn 1 with Blood Crypt, Faithless Looting, discards Oculus and Archon. Not Thoughtseizing us and discarding 2 very big creatures here is very good for me. The best thing about this matchup is that Arne can only really reanimate something on turn 2, 1 at a time. There's not a way for him to reanimate 2 things on turn 2. So this Ghost Vacuum actually checks him from reanimating something on turn 2. If we don't have the Ghost Vacuum here, there is nothing we can do. This is Arne's best possible draw of land, looting, discard 2 big things, untap, reanimate. So this Ghost Vacuum is just the perfect draw here, the perfect card, and lines up perfectly on his mulligan to 6, and is so very, very punishing that I'm not sure he can win the game, and it's turn 2. It's funny when playing in Magic sometimes when you play a hate piece and your opponent kind of stops for a moment and starts thinking, and you kind of realize, oh, they weren't really thinking about what happens if I have the hate piece here because their line didn't set up for it. And there's a bit of pause on Arne's side where I can kind of feel through the computer, as weird as that sounds, that he wasn't prepared for the Ghost Vacuum on turn 1. And although there's probably not much he can do about it, he now has to rethink his entire game plan for the next turn, but also for the entire game. And that is just such a good feeling on our side of the board, as our hand isn't great either, but this sort of pausing and slow, methodical thought processing that Arne is doing just adds a lot of confidence to this hand that I kept that I thought might be a little sketchy. I did mention the Thoughtseize was a concern. Obviously, we dodged that. The other concern that there is about having a Ghost Vacuum is that Arne could always just go blue source on turn 2, play a Psychic Frog. And Psychic Frog is also just very, very, very difficult to deal with. We do have the Static Prison in our hand, but that's not always good enough, and it doesn't always stick around forever because you have to pay energy to keep it around. So we get to keep the frog for a few turns, but if I don't find a Guide of Souls, he's going to get the frog back eventually, and because I don't actually have a lot of threats or a lot of ways to kind of pressure the board for me, I'm just going to fall behind to this frog that's coming back in 3 turns. So it's very fortunate that his hand on 6 was kind of all in on this reanimation plan, but it's also fortunate that he doesn't have a blue source plus frog, and my mediocre slow hand on the draw almost works out perfectly, because now I can safely put this Ajani into play, which normally isn't a great threat, now is because it's 2 creatures when he's representing Fatal Push, but also is a great threat because he's not threatening me. I don't have to use the Static Prison right now. If he does play Frog on the following turn, I get an extra turn because the Frog's underneath the prison for another turn or another attack step, and I don't have to pay energy for it, right? A little bit of time goes by, and Arne ended up casting a Faithless Looting and discarding a Thoughtseize and an Emperor of Bones. The Thoughtseize is certainly late to the party, but also just kind of shows me that his hand on 4 cards is probably full of reanimation spells, other big creatures, and maybe some removal. If he had a frog, or if he had a way to interact with my hand earlier, he definitely would have cast it. And this slow pacing from him, especially playing the Faithless Looting and discarding 2 reasonable cards, I think, kind of shows me that he's looking for something else, or he needs something else. The way his cards in his hand line up isn't good enough for him to win. Now, we're at a point where we do end up in a weird spot. Arne has exhausted a few of his resources, but ends up putting an Oculus into play through our Ghost Vacuum. The unfortunate thing about Oculus against Ghost Vacuum is that it doesn't really line up well for the Ghost Vacuum player ever. Ghost Vacuum is meant to target big creatures your opponent's trying to reanimate in the graveyard. With Oculus on the stack, they get to exile the cards before you can interact with them casting the Oculus. But you also can't really activate your Ghost Vacuum first, because your opponent can just afterwards discard and then reanimate something, and your Ghost Vacuum's tapped, so you don't actually get to, target anything. Obviously, it's nice that we have the backup Static Prison, and he doesn't have another threat in the form of Frog earlier, so we're not sort of squeezed here. But again, if somehow he has another threat that he hasn't cast already, he draws it, or he reanimates it through our Ghost Vacuum, we have no follow-up, and we've drawn a bunch of lands, so we actually could lose this game pretty easily. This doesn't account for the fact that Pyroclasm is pretty good against us here, and this Static Prison is still a liability. We only have 3 energy. We don't have enough damage in play to end the games in 3 turns. There is some saving grace in the idea that Ghost Vacuum for 6 mana can sacrifice and create copies of the creatures that are underneath it, but that's not what I want to be doing with my time or my mana. And I think if we go 3 or 4 turns with my opponent doing nothing and me being able to flash back a Ghost Vacuum, I'm likely winning or going to be in a good enough position anyways. I would really like to find something that sort of pushes me forward in this game faster than we're already pushing forward. Now, it's funny because Arne's sort of draw also is lined up pretty poorly. I do think that this Ghost Vacuum was incredibly punishing for him. We ended up doing nothing on our turn 4 and 5 for the most part, and so did Arne. Now, we did surveil a Johnny to the top of our library, which is a very weak to a Fatal Push, because they just get to push the Johnny that sticks around after we choose to sacrifice the other one. but it does put another cat token into play. It forces them to use a Fatal Push that, they're sitting on. We're not really like looking for anything else. There's nothing more we want out of our deck other than a creature that is threatening a power on the board. Guide of Souls is probably worse here because I would need to go guide into another creature. The guide would also have to survive. If my opponent has Fatal Push for this Johnny, they always have it for the Guide of Souls. Ocelot Pride, very similar, but again, needs to attack and also just gets Fatal Push cleanly. A Johnny is better when it doesn't get Fatal Push. We could be looking for a Season Pyro, but if I find a Season Pyro the following draw step, it's still fine. We're still in a reasonable spot. And then I could be looking for a removal spell, but I don't really need a removal spell. I'm not necessarily under the pressure of anything, so I'm not super worried. Back to the Ghost Vacuum thing, the Johnny being in the graveyard, if they do have Fatal Push, I can flash it back with this Ghost Vacuum and, get the Johnny back. Now here, Arne has exhausted the majority of his resources on his turn, and I'm going to be able to eat this frog or eat the Johnny in my graveyard, untap, activate the Ghost Vacuum for 6, and win the game with the 4 damage I have in play, plus the Archon underneath the Ghost Vacuum. So although I do think we got pretty lucky in this spot, this really does show how impactful Ghost Vacuum is in the matchup and how important it is to, have a plan that breaks up your opponent's synergies because their deck is so synergy based. Even the times when you kind of flood out and draw relatively poorly, you can have 1 or 2 cards that sort of like really shift the game, and we win